Thank you so much for coming out tonight for this exciting talk. My name is Elizabeth Maya Paul, and I'm the director of COLLIS Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture at Cornell United Religious Work. COLLIS, which is Latin for Hill, aims to develop Catholic thought, culture, and community at Cornell University, enriching students, faculty, staff, and community members of all faith traditions and of none. We provide a forum for the study of the Catholic intellectual and cultural traditions, and we explore important questions about the relationship between faith and reasoning, science and religion, virtue and truth, beauty and goodness, debate and others like that. We aim to inspire, enlighten, and challenge our audiences through public lectures like this one, seminars, sacred music, community outreach, and more. Tonight, I am very excited to welcome back to campus Professor Christopher Baglow of Notre Dame University. Chris was here this past summer as an instructor in our summer seminar, Faith at the Frontiers, Origins, Creation, and Extraterrestrial Light. And yes, we did have super intense discussions about theology and aliens. During one of Chris's lectures this summer that was not about aliens, he brought up the history of Cornell co-founder Andrew Dickinson White and his book, A.D. White, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. The lecture was great, and I knew I had to bring Chris back so that more of us Cornellians could learn about this history. So I was super delighted, not only that he was willing to come back, but that he was willing to come back on the eve of Promise of Pilate's feast day and 800th birthday, just tomorrow. And it was a delight that this beautiful venue was available to A.D. White's own house. So Mr. White, we come in peace, and he's the author of the great textbook, Faith, Science, and Reason, Theology on the Cutting Edge. His work has been featured by organizations such as Word on Fire Institute, That Man Is You, Crux, Notre Dame Magazine, and Church Life Journal. He is also on the board of directors of the Society of Catholic Scientists. He is best known for his work helping Catholic educators integrate faith and science in their classrooms, and for creating and directing the Steno Learning Program in Faith and Science. So if any of you are involved in catechesis and parishes or teaching in high schools and interested in faith and reasoning kind of issues, check out his textbook, but also check out the website at McGrath. They have a ton of really amazing resources there. Before we begin this event, I'd just like to acknowledge that this event is made possible in part by the grant In Lumine supporting the Catholic intellectual tradition on college campuses nationwide from the John Templeton Foundation. Now, please help me welcome Dr. Christopher Baglow.
Thank you, Leslie. So I am very delighted to be here again. Cornell is a beautiful place. I know that you can tell from the title of my talk that I'm going to say some critical things about the former owner of this house. As a person who grew up in New Orleans, that scares me a little bit. You kind of have a weird sort of superstition about that. So I actually bought this for protection. I'll put it on right now. All right, everybody. So I'm on the right side. Sorry. In light of my presentation, I want to address the conflict or warfare model of science and religion, specifically the idea that scientific inquiry in the Catholic faith or Christianity or religion in general, depending on who you ask, are intractably opposed to each other, and that the weight of historical evidence supports that characterization. And according to that way of thinking, there is no possibility of harmony between religion and science, because it is assumed that they are rival ways of explaining the universe, and that their practitioners are both aware of that and are actively fighting each other for supremacy. That has become a deeply rooted assumption in the minds of many Americans, and recent research reveals that the perspective of many American young Catholics today have been shaped by it, as many as 70%. So I would just point out this work by sociologist Christian Smith at the University of Notre Dame. In particular, the first and the third bullet here. 72% of Roman Catholic emerging adults in his study accept the inherent warfare of science and religion. 78% who have stopped practicing their faith cite the conflict between science and religion as the reason why. Indeed, I teach faith and science every semester at the University of Notre Dame to undergraduates, and I give them a survey at the beginning of the semester and ask them to give me a couple of questions about the course, right? As you can see, a number of them ask questions that either assume conflict between faith and science or are interested in whether there is a conflict between faith and science, right? This is actually from this month, January 2025, the students I have this semester. So to talk about that, I'd like to approach it in 3 steps, or 2, actually. I want to establish the historical context and the specific persons and events that gave rise to the conflict model. It can be traced to the late 19th century and the work of 2 American authors whose claims about the history of conflict were discredited both then and have been repeatedly since by serious historians. One of them was a scientist and a popular history writer named John William Draper, and the other an historian and the co-founder of Cornell University, Andrew Dixon White, whose beautiful home we are in tonight. It's not an exaggeration to say that these 2 together gave rise to the conflict approach that so many today still accept, even young Catholics still accept as unquestionable. It is often simply called the Draper and White conflict thesis by historians. I hope to offer at least some insight into why their works were so successful and how their claims persist even to this day. Right. Then, after that, I want to talk a little bit more about Andrew Dixon White first, and this idea of little white lies that I gave in my title. I'm going to inflect that quite a bit, as you'll see, so we'll get to that a little bit later. But before I move to that, to prepare us to discuss the context of the conflict model, can I have some audience participation? This is a political cartoon from Harper's Weekly in the 1870s by Thomas Nast. Raise your hands and tell me what you see there. Just don't describe it comprehensively. Save some for the other participants. Yeah, raise your hands. Go ahead. Yeah, yes, sir.
Something, some concern about infallibility of the Pope.
Yes, he is infallible as being taught. This is a classroom, actually. Other things you see up there. Yep.
Bible is getting swept.
Yeah, the Bible is getting swept away. You see anything else down there getting swept away?
I can't remember the other one.
History.
History.
And there's an object being swept away too.
Yeah, the globe, right?
The globe. Right, the globe. Okay, any other things? Who's sitting at the teacher's desk? A bishop. And he's got 2 teacher aides, right? One of them, of course, is doing the sweeping of the classroom. The other one is pointing to he is infallible. You have something like the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the Sacred Heart of Jesus there above, but he can't really tell which. Yes. Yeah. They're kneeling, that's right. And the teacher's desk is an altar. But can somebody, yes. Yes, St. Peter, the keys of the kingdom, very good. Can somebody read to me the epigraph on the bottom?
Foreshadowing of coming events in our public schools.
Foreshadowing of coming events in our public schools. So keep that in your mind as I develop the context for the conflict model. So to trace the roots of the conflict model, we have to place ourselves in mid to late 19th century America and recognize 3 trends, 2 intellectual trends and 1 sociocultural trend that set the stage for the success of Draper and White. The first intellectual development can be traced back to the previous century, the 18th century. A suspicion amongst intellectuals of any Christian doctrines other than moral teaching. So terms such as dogma, divine mystery, article of faith, began to be used pejoratively to characterize foolishness and fear of progress, even religious deception. This is perhaps best and most poignantly captured in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1816 to his friend the Dutch Unitarian minister Adrian van der Kamp about the dogma of the Trinity. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Ridicule is the only weapon which can be used against unintelligible propositions. Ideas must be distinct before reason can act upon them, and no man ever had a distinct idea of the Trinity. It is the mere abracadabra of the tricksters calling themselves the priests of Jesus." By the late 19th century, dogmas had begun to be seen by many as anti-rational, the products of blind, dangerous faith. And many began to think that science should replace dogmas in a crusade to rescue religion from irrational ideas. The recognition that dogmas have to do with realities about God, that therefore by nature are unable to be fully comprehended, that are not anti-rational, that are supra-rational, was lost to view. The second intellectual trend was much more positive. The various areas of study to which we now refer with the umbrella term science, such as physics, chemistry, biology, these were being professionalized. They were taking on a whole new level of respectability and exciting popular enthusiasm through the new knowledge and industrial medical benefits that they were producing. For science, the 19th century was one of the very best of times. This was the age of Lyell's geology. If you were born in the year 1800, most of your life, you would not have thought that the world was millions and millions of years old. But by the end of your life, if you lived a good long time, you would. This was the age of Pasteur's germ theory. Above all, Darwin's Origin of Species. And as a result, science as we define it today began to stand out as a specific and separate pursuit. This change in perception even involved a change in vocabulary. Before the 19th century and really into the early 19th century, the word science referred to any knowledge demonstrated systematically or logically, including theological knowledge. The words philosophy and science were treated as synonyms. As in the title of a book published in 1821, Elements of the Philosophy of Plants, containing the scientific principles of botany. But by the late 19th century, the term science and scientific method began to be associated exclusively with the study of the physical universe through observation and experiment. This change of perception, as I've said, added new words to the English vocabulary, such as the terms scientist and physicist. Those were coined in 1833 by an Anglican theologian and natural philosopher named William Ewell. Sadly, the restriction of the science word family to one kind of human knowledge left open the possibility that other areas of human knowledge, such as philosophy, ethics, other areas of philosophy, ethics, morality, art, poetry, theology, that those could be considered subjective and unfruitful flights of fancy, right? By comparison. Not a necessary consequence of this importance being given to science, but a possible one, and one that in fact actually did happen. The last trend is a particularly Anglo-American trend, and it was sociocultural. It was the rise of anti-Catholic prejudice, even mania, in the United States as a response to the influx of Irish and other Catholic immigrants, beginning in the mid-1840s. From the perspective of the Catholic Church in the 19th century USA, the mid to late 19th century was one of the worst of times. The decade of the 1870s marked a high point of anti-Catholic prejudice. What was going on? Well, the American bishops were seeking tax-exempt status for tuition at Catholic schools, and the battle was fierce and unsuccessful for the bishops. In 1871, in Harper's Weekly, the famous political cartoonist Thomas Nast, whom you've already met, published one of his greatest or most well-known images, the American River Ganges. So the image shows a Protestant public school teacher with a Bible tucked into his waist, shielding children from menacing crocodiles. And if you look closely at the menacing crocodiles, what do you see? Their jaws are jewel-encrusted bishop's miters, and their faces, which are down, facing down into the water, are actually stereotypical Irish faces, right? Up here on the cliff, Boss Tweed of New York City, a Catholic politician and a corrupt one, is handing children down to be devoured. Over here, Lady Liberty is being led off to be hung. Yeah. Across the waters, what do you see? Well, you see what looks like what famous church? St. Peter's Basilica, yes. Except inscribed on it is Tammany Hall. That's the corrupt political machine, or the center of Boss Tweed's kind of political empire. And you can't read it very well, but on the colonnade it says the political Roman Catholic school. Right here, the U.S. public school in the foreground is crumbling. Okay, so while this anti-Catholic phenomena had nothing to do with the change in perceptions about science, it did create an intellectual environment in which bigotry and prejudice against Catholics was ripe to be exploited for social and political change. The majority of Catholic immigrants were poor, illiterate, which gave their religion an air of ignorance and superstition to non-Catholics, especially white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, a bias against the possibility of Catholics being able or to contribute to, or at least even open to, the progress of knowledge ruled the day. And so false claims about the history of the church and science could draw upon the fuel of anti-Catholic fears and hatred to promote the greatness of science to the detriment of religion. So, dogmas and mysteries are obstacles to human progress. Science is the new gold standard of human progress. The Catholic Church is enemy number one of human progress. And with those assumptions, the situation was ripe for claims of conflict between science and the Catholic faith, and they would not be long in appearing. But, gotta remember to use this here. In 1874, John William Draper, a successful American chemist, the founder actually of the American Chemical Society, and the early innovator of photography, was the first human being to photograph the moon, published his book entitled History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. He begins by making this judgment: the history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries. It is a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on one side and the compression arising from traditional faith. Shortly after this declaration, this is in his foreword, he qualifies it by proclaiming the innocence of Protestant and Greek Orthodox Christians, whom he claims have never opposed the advancement of knowledge and have always had, quote, a reverential attitude to truth from whatever quarter it might come. He later refers to Protestantism as the twin sister of science. The true religious enemy of science is the Roman Catholic Church, which he indicts for rejecting science and engaging in violent means to maintain power over its adherents in its attempt to gain total political supremacy over all peoples. In speaking of Christianity, reference is generally made to the Roman Church. None of the Protestant churches has ever occupied a position so imperious. None has ever had such widespread political influence. But in the Vatican, we have only to recall the Inquisition. The hands that are now raised in appeals to the most merciful are crimsoned. They have been steeped in blood. Objective history writing that. Anyway, as you can imagine, this is not exactly what you would call scholarly work. There are no footnotes in the book. Throughout the rest of the book, Draper alleges conflict after conflict between the Catholic Church and science while offering little or no evidence. He makes up details and he presents them as facts. He rearranges sequences of events in order to support his position. He selects quotes from various figures of the church that seem to support his case, and then he refuses to give the context. He even leaves out parts of those quotes that call into question his interpretation of them. For example, Draper condemns Catholic bishop and theologian St. Augustine of Hippo for teaching that the sky is stretched out like a skin over a flat earth. Remember the globe being swept away? Actually, Augustine, he's actually quoting a passage from Augustine's commentary on Genesis, where Augustine quotes Psalm 104, verse 2. Lord my God, you are great indeed. You stretched out the sky like a skin. Why is Augustine quoting that psalm? He's quoting it in order to demonstrate his principle that the Bible must be read figuratively, not literally, in its depictions of natural phenomena. He actually affirms in the rest of the sentence the very position Draper accuses him of rejecting. Rational arguments, Augustine concludes, informs us that the sky has the shape of a hollow globe all around us. And why, by the way, would the sky be shaped like a globe? Because it surrounds a globe. Augustine knows that, and as we'll see, so did everybody else. Draper ends his own book with prophecy of doom for religion and victory for science. Now, if you think about the context that I set for you, those three factors, you'll hear all of them in this final quote. As to the issue of the coming conflict, can anyone doubt? Whatever is resting on fiction and fraud will be overthrown. Institutions that organize impostors and spread delusions must show what right they have to exist. Faith must render an account of herself to reason. Mysteries must give way, or must give place to facts. Religion must relinquish that imperious, that domineering position which she has so long maintained against science. Oh, Draper's book was an instant success. The conflict outsold every other book in the series in which it was included. Since then, it has been reprinted 50 times and has been translated into 10 languages. And even today, it remains readily available. Now, numerous critics emerged to respond to Draper's work, including Orestes Brownson, the celebrated intellectual and Catholic convert who is interred in the crypt of Sacred Heart Basilica at Notre Dame. I get commissioned when I say those kind of things. Anyway, one shared criticism is that the conflict seemed to be written with the primary aim being not accurate history writing, but bestseller status, like the Da Vinci Code. In the May 23rd, 1875 issue of the San Francisco newspaper, The Daily Alta California, one reviewer put it this way: he may be a rhapsodist, but he, Draper, is no historian. He is neither unprejudiced nor painstaking. If he investigated authorities, he does not dare to cite them to sustain his ballooning allegations. His book is an immense pretension. Importantly, most importantly, I think, this anonymous reviewer knows that the real facts of history are often the opposite of what Draper claims, showing that Draper was not invincibly ignorant. Had he done any serious research, he would have known better. He himself, the reviewer, corrects Draper on three claims. First, he notes that the murder of the pagan philosopher, the female pagan philosopher Hypatia, by a mob in Alexandria, Egypt, in the year 413, was a political struggle. It was not, as Draper claims, animated by, quote, Christian fear and envy of her skill in mathematics. He also points out that Giordano Bruno's execution by the Inquisition was really because of theological heresies. Draper claims it was primarily because of his belief in a plurality of worlds and a heaven filled with, quote, space and stars. At this, no one had ever noticed that before. And finally, the reviewer also knows that Galileo's condemnation had more to do with his recklessness and lack of discretion than an entrenched theological or ecclesial antagonism towards any cosmology that, I'm using Draper's words, threatened the assertions of the Bible. Okay, onward. Andrew Dixon White. Andrew Dixon White was an American historian and the co-founder of Cornell University. Anybody tell me when? 1865, very good. The first purely secular institution, private institution of higher learning in the United States. And for this, he and his co-founder, Ezra Cornell, were subjected to criticism for separating learning from religion. Criticism that came mostly from competitors at Protestant institutions of higher learning like Harvard, Princeton, Brown, Yale, etc. And in response, White decided to write a book showing that both religion and science would be better off once, quote, dogmatic theology, the subject not included in the curriculum at Cornell, was fully overcome. As he wrote to Ezra Cornell in 1869, I will give them a lesson, meaning their critics, which they will remember. He delivered this lesson to his opponents over the next 27 years, in which he published 27 articles that he finally brought together in a 2-volume work, History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, which he first published in 1896. He begins by the book in his own foreword by praising Draper for his work of great ability. He then goes on to repeat many of Draper's errors, including one that remains quite influential today, the flat earth dogma, as he calls it. White claims that until Christopher Columbus's time, the majority of Christian thinkers had insisted on biblical grounds that the earth was flat, and that a flat earth was practically a dogma of the church. In reality, only 2 Christian thinkers of record, the Roman Christian apologist Lactantius, who lived from about 250 to 325 AD, and the Byzantine monk Cosmas Indicopleustes, who lived in the 6th century, had ever argued that the earth was flat. St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Ambrose of Milan, they all testified to the sphericity of the earth, as does St. Albert the Great, as does popular medieval writers such as Dante and Chaucer. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas, the eve of whose 800th birthday we mark this evening, in the very first article of the very first question of the very first book of his enormous Summa Theologiae, writes this: sciences are differentiated according to the various means through which knowledge is obtained. For the astronomer and the naturalist, both may prove the same conclusion, that the earth, for instance, is round, but they do so in different ways. Well, despite all that evidence, White represents the entire Christian tradition as committed to a flat earth. He presents Lactantius and Cosmas as typical representatives. To add a touch of drama, he adopts Washington Irving's fictional account of Christopher Columbus struggling unsuccessfully to convince Catholic priests and professors that the earth is spherical. An encounter at the University of Salamanca in the year 1487. Now, this meeting and debate at Salamanca with Columbus and these professors did happen. Right, we'll get back to that. Here's how White describes it. The warfare of Columbus the world knows well, how sundry wise men of Spain confronted him with the usual quotations from the Psalms, from St. Paul, and from St. Augustine, how even after he was triumphant and after his voyage had greatly strengthened the theory of the earth's sphericity, the church by its highest authority solemnly stumbled and persisted in going astray. Well, actually,
This is about
Christianity
Christianity.
agreed with Columbus that the earth was round. What was debated at Salamanca was not whether the earth was flat or round, it was the size of the earth. Columbus thought that it was small enough to get to Asia with sufficient supplies. And the sundry wise men of Salamanca thought it was much larger. And guess who was right? The sundry wise men of Salamanca. So, the 1-2 punch of Draper and White has had a remarkable long-standing effect on popular opinion, appealing to the prejudices of their day, riding a wave of scientific progress that created the very conflict they came to resolve. The errors and misrepresentations they foisted upon their readers, I mean, that's a little bit too harsh, sorry, are now routinely repeated as historical facts by non-historians, finding new life in the work of science popularizers, such as Cornell's own Carl Sagan, who, in his 1980 series Cosmos, talks about Galileo being tormented in a Catholic dungeon for heretical ideas. We actually have the floor plan of the 2,500 square foot palatial room that Galileo actually was in, and in which he was able to have his favorite Tuscan foods brought to him from the Tuscan embassy. He was not tormented in a Catholic dungeon. Neil deGrasse Tyson actually adopts Draper's account and White's account of Giordano Bruno's execution in his own 2014 remake of Cosmos. So, let's move forward then. Draper and White excoriated the church for its emphasis on dogma and revealed religion. Their approach resonates a great deal with that of Martin Luther, though in a way that Luther would neither have anticipated nor desired. Luther held up the Bible as the sole source of religious truth and the antidote to the corruption of tradition. Draper and White replaced the Bible and Christian doctrine with science as the sole source of truth. And they attacked the Christian theological tradition for the sake of science. So Luther's insistence on sola scriptura is replaced with their insistence on sola scientia. But what about this question of whether or not they were conscious of their falsehoods? I'm going to set aside Draper for a moment because he's not serious enough to really take seriously. White, however, was a serious scholar, a serious historian. And I do think that the issue with White had not so much to do with events, but with principles that he thought the church held that caused him to interpret certain events in the history of the church as representing one thing when in fact they did not represent that thing, right? In fact, what I'd like to do is I would like to show you two principles that we can find running through the Catholic theological tradition that are quite the contrary of the claims that Draper and White made about that tradition, right? And in seeing that, we'll see, I think, better why such a great man made such a big mistake. All right? So, Draper and White claimed that the church was in principle at least indifferent, or more likely antagonistic towards change of any kind in her teaching. Draper wrote, "A divine revelation admits of no improvement, no change, no advance. It discourages all new discovery." Indeed, according to White, the definition of papal infallibility in 1870 required that nothing new ever be asserted, even in matters of empirical investigation, ignoring the church's limitation of the charism of infallibility to matters of what? Two matters. Yeah. Faith and morals, right? Faith and morals. Infallibility never had anything to do with questions of natural science. But White didn't catch that. He says omniscience cannot be limited to a restricted group of questions. In its very nature, it implies the knowledge of all, and infallibility means omniscience. No. Actually, we have numerous examples of great thinkers of the church's history embracing well-demonstrated facts about the universe and the established scholarly insights of their age in which they live, and allowing new knowledge to challenge their understanding of revealed truths, of biblical passages, etc., bringing about development in Christian doctrine. Let me give you a few examples. In his commentary on the book of Genesis, written in 414 AD, which we've already referred to, St. Augustine of Hippo relied on established astronomical observations to come to the conclusion that the first creation account, that's Genesis chapter 1 and the first few verses of chapter 2, the sixth day creation account and the seventh day of the Sabbath, you guys are familiar with that, of course, that must be a symbolic account, not a scientific treatise. Why? Well, in the first creation account, each day ends with evening came and morning followed. And so Augustine realizes that the 6 days mentioned cannot possibly be days in the way that we think of actual 24-hour days. Why? Well, because It was well known in his day, as it is in ours, that the time of night and day are different in various parts of the world. But if I say that the days, he wrote, are 24-hour periods, I am afraid I will be laughed at by those who know for certain that during the time when it is night with us, the presence of light is illuminating those parts of the world past which the sun is returning from its setting to its rising. So then, are we really going to station God in some part of the world where evening can be made for him while the light withdraws from that part to another? Well, of course not, right? No serious theologian would ever think God was standing over here when he said evening came and morning followed, right? Whereas in San Francisco, the sun was still shining. And Augustine actually identifies this deference to what has been shown by science as a principle that we must apply to the interpretation of the entire Bible, according to him. He says, when anyone is able, from reliable evidence, to prove some fact about the nature of things, we shall show that it is not contrary to our scripture. We should hold on to Christ, in whom are stored all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, so that we are not frightened out of our wits by the superstitions of false religion. For consider, over 1,000 years later, the response of the Jesuit Cardinal St. Robert Bellarmine to Galileo's claim that the earth moves around the sun, and the possibility that his idea contradicted passages in sacred scripture, the most significant being Joshua chapter 10, verse 12 through 14. That's where we're told by this sacred scripture that God made the sun stand still in the sky for the sake of the victory of the Israelites over the Amorites. Well, listen to what Bellarmine wrote. He's writing about Galileo, but not to Galileo. He's writing to a Carmelite priest named Paolo Foscarini. I say that if there were a true demonstration that the sun is at the center of the world, and by that meaning what we would call the solar system, back then they would have thought it was the whole universe, and that the earth is in the third heaven, and that the sun does not circle the earth, but the earth circles the sun, then one would have to proceed with great care in explaining the scriptures that appear contrary and say that we do not understand them, rather than say that what is demonstrated is false. But I will not believe that there is such a demonstration until it is shown to me. He doesn't say we must reject any discovery that tells us something different than that the sun is at the center. He says, no, if that's demonstrated, then we're going to have to go back and realize we need to reinterpret those so as to better understand them. But notice the last sentence. Many people don't realize that Galileo had demonstrated nothing. All three of his proofs for heliocentrism were discredited even in his own lifetime. And it would be 100 years before heliocentrism was demonstrated. Right? Okay. Not knocking Galileo. He's great. He just didn't have the goods. Okay, anyway. 2.5 centuries later, in 1870, the Catholic priest and theologian, St. John Henry Newman, would make a similar judgment in light of Darwin's theory of evolution, and specifically the age of the Earth. Scientists had then begun to speculate that the planet was anywhere from 20 million to 400 million years old, not 6,000 years, as had been once assumed. And in response to these new hypotheses, Newman was entirely open. He notes the distinction, which, by the way, if you're coming to the seminar tomorrow, we'll talk about a lot, between primary and secondary causality, with God as primary cause, giving existence to all things, and making them to be causes of each other, right? And creatures, of course, being those secondary causes. He wrote, if secondary causes are conceivable at all, an almighty agent being supposed, I don't see why the series of living things should not last for millions of years rather than thousands. He wrote that in 1863, 1869 rather, 4 years before Draper would claim that the sacred science of a 6,000-year-old earth had been a dogma of the church since the time of Augustine. So in all three cases, we see important representatives of the Catholic tradition giving the discoveries of science a kind of veto power in interpreting biblical texts. When new scientific knowledge is achieved, it then serves to help us understand how to better interpret sacred scripture which is not held as a reason to reject new knowledge. The witness of sacred tradition teaches us that reason should always inform and strengthen our faith, that we should have a native trust of what reason discovers. Close to our own day, this is exactly what St. John Paul II was getting at when he wrote in 1988 in a letter to the director of the Vatican Observatory that science can purify religion from error and superstition. Besides keeping faith and reason together, we also find a second principle, a commitment to the integrity of nature for the sake of honoring the creator's opening wisdom. By the integrity of nature, here, let's look at Draper and Pike's characterizations of the church's understanding of divine action. According to Draper, the Christian was convinced of incessant providential interventions. He believed that there was no such thing as law in the government of the world. Religion rejects the intervention of secondary causes, meaning creaturely causes, in nature. For his part, White claims that when Newton discovered his laws of universal motion, quote, men had come to a vast new conception destined to be fatal to the old theory of creation. For he had shown throughout the universe, in place of almighty caprice, all-pervading love. The caprice being God, just like getting in there and doing this and poking that and causing this, and you know what I mean? Because he's bored or something. Nothing could be further from the truth. The great thinkers of the Catholic tradition are very careful to avoid supernaturalism, to avoid relying on divine miraculous interventions as an explanation for how the universe works. Nowadays, we call this, and quite rightly, the God of the gaps error, right? We find a gap in what we understand. We say, oh, God must be doing that directly. And then science explains how it actually works, and the gap is closed. The church has never approached the world that way. Instead, the great thinkers of our tradition emphasize the wisdom of God in establishing the universe in such a way that it could bring about the ends he intends for it. They avoid suggesting any kind of divine micromanagement of the universe. They reject the temptation to see God as constantly tinkering with or fixing the universe through miraculous intervention. Once again, St. Augustine's commentary on Genesis is a prime example. Augustine was inspired by his reverence for God's perfect wisdom. And so he found the idea of separate creative acts on God's part to be problematic, even to explain the origin of living things and even of human beings. Augustine speculates that if God is perfect, his creative act must also be perfect. It should not lack anything. It should require no additional divine acts to complete it. So Augustine speculated that God created the universe with everything needed to be life-producing naturally. For example, he taught that all living things, human beings included, naturally existed in the universe from its first moment, not as actual organisms, but as rational seeds, which he identified as existing, quote, in the very fabric, as it were, or texture of the elements. Although he had no idea of common descent from an original ancestor, nor of natural selection, nor of genetic mutation. In other words, he didn't know how this would work. In fact, he's really open about his confusion about how it could happen. Like, was the first man an infant produced by the world as an infant or as a full-grown adult? He knows if he was produced as an infant, he would just die, right? So he goes for the full-grown adult, that he doesn't know how that is, but he doesn't want to say it's a miracle. It's kind of a big mess. But the integrity of nature as the source of life that Darwin would champion 1.5 millennia later was already being celebrated by this father and doctor of the church. And he made this into a principle for interpreting scripture. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 7, we read, God made the heavens and separated the waters which were under the heavens from the waters above the heavens. Apparently there was some tangling amongst biblical interpreters about what that meant. Some thought that God must have put waters actually above the stars. Well, listen to what Augustine says. Many people insist that these waters can't be above the constellations because their gravity dictates that they be carried up as vapor into the air that is nearest the earth, what we call our atmosphere. He's right about that, of course, right? Nor should anybody try to refute them by appealing to the power of God. For whom all things are possible, and said that we just have to believe that God can cause even water as heavy as we know it to be spread over the stars. Our business is to inquire how God's scriptures say he established things according to their proper natures, and not what he might wish to work in them as a miracle of his power. When we get to the Middle Ages, we have numerous examples of the same respect for the integrity of nature. In the early 12th century, Abelard of Bath and his Questiones Naturalis, or Questions on Nature, which marks the dawn of medieval science, he develops it in the form of a Platonic dialogue between himself and his nephew. His nephew believed that the spontaneous appearance of life in a dish of dried soil was miraculous. At a time when there was a strong devotion to miracles, it would have been easy for Abelard to agree. Instead, Abelard draws a firm distinction between the action of the Creator and the natural workings of this creation. I forgot to put the slide in, but I'll read to you what he wrote. It is the will of the Creator that herbs should sprout from the earth, but the same is not without a natural reason either. When his nephew persisted and pointed out that a natural explanation from the doctrine of the four elements was inadequate, he stuck to his point. Whatever there is from him and through him, meaning God. But the realm of being is not a confused one, nor is it lacking in disposition, which human knowledge can go, should be consulted. In other words, we should persist in seeking a natural explanation and avoid attributing anything that we do not understand to the direct action of God. 1,000 years after Augustine and a century after Abelard, St. Thomas Aquinas would put it more directly. In the first founding of the order of nature, he wrote, we must not look for miracles, but for what is in accordance with nature. In other words, we should persist in seeking a natural explanation and avoid attributing anything that we do not understand to the direct action of God. Now, as a theologian, I must bring up this question. In embracing the integrity of nature, are Augustine and Aquinas rejecting miracles entirely? The answer is no. What they're rejecting is the idea that somehow God could not establish a natural order that does what he intends. They completely believe in miracles, but they believe that miracles are when God empowers physical causes to transcend their ordinary capacity, to be able to do things they could not do. God does this singularly. It's not something that he's doing all the time so that you get the right circumstances together. You know, like you get the right temperature, water freezes, and you get the right circumstances together, God makes a miracle happen, right? No, that's the way nature works. That's not the way God works. And this is a sign of God's message of salvation, right? The miracle is God about saving human beings. Consequently, contra the creationists that are loudly proclaiming are loudly rejecting evolutionary science, contrary to creationists, it doesn't make sense from the Catholic perspective for God to do a miracle when there were no human beings there to put their faith in it. Okay. I saved the best part. It's not from Aquinas, but someone who loved it very much. Centuries later, once evolutionary biology suggested that human beings have an evolutionary origin connecting them to all living things on Earth, St. John Henry Newman would write this deliciously sarcastic passage in his private philosophical journal. There is as much want of simplicity in the idea of creation of distinct species as in that of the creation of trees in full growth, or of rocks with fossils in them. I mean that it is strange that monkeys should be so like men, with no historical connection between men and monkeys, as that there should be no course of facts by which fossil bones got into rocks. I will either go the whole hog with Darwin, or dispensing with time and history altogether, hold not only the theory of distinct species, unconnected species, species created miraculously by God, but also of the creation by God of fossil-bearing rocks. He wrote those words in 1864. That's only 5 years after Darwin published The Origin of Species, 10 years before Draper published The Conflict, 32 years before E.D. White published The Warfare, and 1 year before the founding of Cornell University. These examples show or represent a thorough commitment to the integrity of nature due to the perfection of divine wisdom and power. They show how very different the Catholic way of honoring the Creator is from the false charges of Draper and White, but also from creationism. The great thinkers of the Catholic tradition sought to appreciate as much as possible the causality of creatures, not to get God out of the picture, but to glorify God. Because God is most profoundly at work when the universe is able to do his will. God is not one cause among many. God is the cause of all causes. And the more a creature can do, the more it shows forth the power of God. Creationism, which by the way is itself a reaction to the conflict model. Creationism incorrectly squeezes God into the picture of nature. Catholicism gives the whole picture to him. So in summary, or in conclusion, the prevailing misconceptions of inherent conflict between science and religion, both warfare between science and theology, is precisely that, a misconception. But it is also a challenge to Catholics today, and perhaps particularly to Catholics at Cornell today, to adopt the humble, open dialogue approach and seek the relational unity so eloquently expressed and fervently desired by St. John Paul II, but also Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. We have to recognize that the more that scientific literacy and discoveries become part of our common worldview, the more a sense of their relation to the Catholic faith becomes essential for us to proclaim the gospel. And so I will leave you with the whole quote from John Paul II that then answer any questions you might have. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish. St. John Paul II, pray for us. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. And thank you all very much for your attention and patience. Appreciate it. No, I got nice enough to Mr. White. I hope that was. Believe me, if you were to read his work side by side with Draper's work, you realize I don't have disrespect for it. Just some things I'd like to correct.
Thank you so much, Chris.
You're welcome.
We have some time for questions. So if you can raise your hand if you're in here, and then folks online, you can enter questions into the chat and we'll try to get to you.
Thank you, Professor.
Cool.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting talk. I learned a lot. I was wondering if you could comment on the reception of George Lemaitre's work in the founding of the Big Bang, because I've heard a story of how that came about that's presented in sort of warfare terms, where like the scientists rejected it as it seemed to give too much credence to a first day of creation, and the Pope was receptive to it because of the seeming affirmation of the Bible. He sort of didn't want to be in either camp, but you can just like correct my understanding with that story.
Sure. So you have two responses. I mean, one of them is, and remember, these are scientists who are human beings just like us, and they're saturated in conflict model thinking. They're worried that he's trying to give a God of the gaps at the beginning of the universe, right? He's not. He makes it very clear that he does not think that what he is suggesting proves the existence of God. Right? Unfortunately, Pius XII took it in that direction in a address he gave to the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences in 1952. And Lemaitre actually got in touch with him immediately and said, "Holy Father, please don't do that again." Right. He said, my hypothesis about the beginning of the universe does not prove the existence of God, right? That's not why I'm doing it, and that's not what I'm trying to get it to. But he was a man of great faith. Of course, himself, that he was true. right? Not this much. So I decided to follow both between science, sure. And Jonathan Medina is now the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, sadly, and not here at Cornell. He's like the most devoted and one of the best presenters on metals I've never heard. So, yeah. Yeah, that's hot.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I would say I think you've successfully kind of shown the naive scientism actually about the two authors to be kind of,
Yeah.
a failure as a theory. But I'm wondering how you respond to the more sophisticated naturalists, like I think someone like Graham Oppie, J.L. Mackey, Gregory Dawes, says, okay, look, I understand that we can't show this conflict model to be true, but maybe what we can do is we have naturalistic explanations and theistic explanations. And we take a principle of Occam's razor, where it seems that in the theist view, you have these secondary causes, and then you have God as the primary cause. Whereas in the naturalist position, we have all these secondary causes, but there isn't a need for this primary cause. To kind of paraphrase Laplace, we don't need the theistic hypothesis because naturalistic explanations are more simple. They have a higher degree of explanatory power. So it's not like a demonstration in terms of saying that, yes, science is surely in conflict with religion. It's more of that in the two theoretical traditions, a naturalistic paradigm seems to do a better job of explaining reality than a theistic one does. So I'm wondering how you would respond to the more, I guess, careful and nuanced kind of naturalistic thesis that's different from the more naive one discussed here today.
Yeah. I appreciate it. I don't think it escapes the problems, though. For example, this idea of, well, let's apply Occam's razor. As soon as you say that about a theological explanation, you demonstrated you don't understand what theology explains. You don't add God as one cause among the world and then scrape them off. God plus the world is not more than the world because God is not a being. God is existence subsisting in itself, causing all things to be, right? And the very fact, the sheer fact of things existing is itself, I think, a potent philosophical thing that needs to be taken very, very seriously. So the good news is this for Mackey and the rest. My religion doesn't threaten their naturalism at all. In fact, I'm a robust methodological naturalist when it comes to science, or a scientist, right? I want a natural explanation and I want all of it. And I don't see God as taking away from it at all. Because as a follower of St. Thomas Aquinas, whose happy memory we're celebrating, right? God is not, a natural effect is not done partly by God and partly by a natural agent. It's wholly done by both, each in their own way. See what I'm saying? So why do they keep trying to scrape away what I haven't inserted? It seems to be a kind of a crypto scientist. Right? Yeah. Is that helpful?
Yeah, to play a little devil's advocate.
You can.
I would,
I was hoping to provoke that.
all right. So I think Mackey and Oppie would say, all right, fine. Well, I'll accept this theory. Like God is not just one being, he's being itself, as the classical theistic Thomistic tradition says. But it seems that now to avoid this problem, you're just invoking an cosmological argument from contingency. Like it seems you've now shifted the debate from naturalistic versus theistic explanations to say, well, look, existence itself needs a foundation. And so Mackey and Oppie are like, all right, okay, I'm happy to have that discussion. But it seems when it comes to the discussion of naturalistic versus theistic explanations, you're happy to kind of say, like, look, if the naturalists can't account for this contingency, then it seems there's a problem there. So I would just say maybe they just say, like, yeah, the discussion is now moving into a more metaphysical direction as opposed to the methodological naturalist.
And they'd be right. Yeah, I like metaphysics. I think it's good stuff.
That's right.
In fact, their very notion of causality, as men of science and scientific literate philosophers, comes from metaphysics. Right? So, I mean, I like going in metaphysical directions. And as long as they don't want to try to constrain me from doing that, I'm not trying to constrain them into going in that direction too. And also, I would say that, by the way, that whatever conclusion I would come to from the argument from contingency, that is not faith. Right? Faith is God reaching out to the whole person and the person responding. If science is thinking before deciding, faith is deciding before thinking. And you know what else is like that? My marriage. You know what I'm saying? I mean, when I was 27 years old, I got up in front of family and friends from all over. And I said these words to my wife, and I knew what they meant: for rich or for poor, sickness and in health, till death do we part. But what's your name? Sean. Did I really know what those things were about? Do you think I know better what they mean now, 29 years later? You know how I got there? When I got hit with more poor or more sick or more hurt than I was expecting, I decided and then started thinking. Different approach entirely. And if Mackie and those guys don't have anything to do with that, I feel sorry for them. But I'm not going to accuse them, right? Yeah. Anyway.
Any other question?
Hey.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I'm wondering, given the apparent disconnect between the scientific consensus and the theological consensus today, what might be a way to bridge that gap or try to remove the misconception that faith and science conflict?
Yeah. Let me tell you that disconnect between science and theology. You know whose fault it is? It's not Richard Dawkins' fault. It's not Christopher Hitchens' fault. It's not Daniel Dennett's fault. It's theologians' fault. It's on us. We have not taken seriously the need to reflect on what the book of nature says as we try to understand more deeply what God has revealed in the book of Scripture, right? And so consequently, we stay off at our own little dogmatic castles doing our thing, and we don't think about what it means to live in an evolutionary universe enough. We don't think what it means to think about the world as developing the way it is. That's what I hope to do. I was, in fact, not originally interested in faith and science. My faith and science career came about 20 years ago when I was a Hurricane Katrina refugee and a school asked me to create a curriculum for them. And that I didn't have any, but now it's all I do because I've become convinced that the theological, and you know who else was convinced of that? Read John Paul II's letter to the director of the Vatican Observatory. Our reflections on religion have become too sterile, he says, because we haven't engaged science. So it's on us, no doubt. See that, A.D. White? I'm not just blaming you. Me too. Yes. Yes, sir.
So I'm still reeling from Nash's cartoon depicting a Protestant minister protecting the children of America from excessive theology.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a public school teacher.
I mean, this is just really mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments about the irony of that? I mean,
It is kind of crazy. I mean, I've seen there's tons of good. There's tons of political cartoons from the period, not just by Nast, that are all over this. And 19th century political cartoonists were pretty mean. Like, you know, like they make the people in Saturday Night Live seem like benign. You know, in terms of the people they make fun of. Yeah.
It's like the Catholic Church is currently, at least, so far in the other direction from fundamentalists, certainly.
Yeah.
In terms of that, any kind of warfare.
But yeah, and the thing is that there was not any real fundamentalism then. It was the conflict model that inspired that reaction. And that's what you're dealing with. I mean, it's like there's this back and forth. They antagonize each other into existence. The Dawkins, the Hitchenses of the world, the John William Draper of the world, Drapers of the world. They make the people that build the Creation Museum or the Colby Center for Creation among Catholics. That's where that comes from. They make each other. And we need to forget about both of them, I think, and think about what science has shown us about the world. Yeah.
But okay, so one other piece of this is the Enlightenment, right? Which you don't mention by name.
I don't.
But I mean,
But it's in there.
You've got Voltaire, Helvetius, you've got all of that going on. Before there is a science as we know it today, or a period of development science,
Sure.
it's also fundamental to conflict.
Yeah.
So, as you point out, a lot of that's political as well. Right?
Yes.
But it's very hard to separate those threads.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you got to start somewhere. You're right. The Enlightenment. I mean, this is all a product of that too. But there's only so much you can say in a short period of time. Auguste Comte, the French philosopher. That was the inspiration for John William Draper. You know, and he's an Enlightenment figure too. So, Yeah. So, I mean, everything you always say is somewhat of an oversimplification just because time itself requires it. You had a question. I think maybe is this the last one? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm wondering to what extent that Draper and White are a bit like strawmen in the sense that the areas of conflict that you focus on mostly are about natural events as they pertain to inanimate objects, and that's easier to make consistent with Catholicism than when it comes to human agency. And so there's three areas in which I think it's more challenging to answer the conflict.
Yeah.
One you already mentioned, miracles. You explicitly described that as violations of laws of nature.
No.
Well, you did. You said a physical cause goes
I said
against
the empowerment of natural causes to do what's beyond their ordinary capacity. That's not violation.
the ordinary capacity means law of nature.
That's right. As empowerment beyond it is not a violation of it.
That's maybe a semantic exam, but it sounds like it goes against
Well,
methodological.
I don't think it's because violation has pejorative connotations. And empowerment is actually going beyond nature. The author of nature can do that.
But it's supernatural?
Yes.
Because in the talking said there was no room for supernatural activities whatsoever.
For natural phenomenon. That's different. The resurrection is not a natural phenomenon. You get the idea? In other words, what I'm saying is that when God empowers natural causes in a supernatural way, they do things beyond their capacity. But the church has never created that as a way of explaining why keys fall to the ground when I drop them out of my pocket, or why the planets go around the sun, or any of the other things that are described by science. So they're not strong.
But surely every single event is also described by science, and every particular event can be categorized as a scientific event, and therefore it should fall under the domain of laws of nature. So whenever you're taking even one situation, such as the resurrection of Christ, then is there no conflict there about that particular event as to what the scientific is?
I don't think so. Why would the laws of nature require that nothing beyond them could ever occur? Why must the world be a strictly closed causal system?
Well, I'd say that that's part of the meaning of methodological naturalism.
No.
It's the assumption.
Ontological naturalism, yes. Methodological naturalism, no. If I'm studying a phenomenon and I am methodologically assuming that it has a natural explanation, I'm a methodological naturalist. If I'm saying that only natural explanations exist, I'm being an ontological naturalist. There's a difference. You can be one and not be the other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's start just a short second part.
Human freedom.
Dualism. Yeah, dualism. So that was a big on philosophy you have to deal with. How do we deal with the challenge of the soul and anything super physical? And currently, it seems like there's a gigantic consensus amongst most scientists and philosophers of science that dualism is no longer tenable with the current view of science that we have. But isn't dualism an essential part of much of Catholic doctrine? The paternity of soul after the
What do you mean by dualism? Do you mean that the soul and the body are two separate things?
Yes.
That's heretical. That's contrary to Catholic doctrine. The Council of Vienna said that the soul is the form of the body and that they form one spirit, one human being. So yeah, Catholics reject that heresy.
And the soul dies when we die?
No. The soul can continue on because it has powers that go beyond the body, but that is an unnatural continuation, and it's not, strictly speaking, the human person that exists. As St. Thomas Aquinas says, the soul is not the entire man, and I am not my soul. Right? So what continues can then be reunited with the body in the resurrection of the body, which of course every Catholic professes to believe in every Sunday. The resurrection of the body and life everlasting. We're not just talking about Jesus' resurrection, we're talking about God in his salvific will, reuniting us and bringing us to a new heavens and earth.
Is that kind of what's being said now under transhumanist philosophy, that the soul can survive beyond the body? That the soul can be taken and put into something and live past a natural human life?
That's what they might be claiming. I don't think it accomplished that.
Could you speak at anything about
Sure.
science and religion and how those are merging together under the philosophies that are developing under the Fourth Industrial Revolution?
Well, I don't know enough about the fourth industrial revolution to say. I guess you're talking about AI, transhumanism. Yeah. So what have we accomplished in this fourth industrial revolution thus far? I mean, have we actually brought about something transhuman?
Well, depend, like, that's what your definition of transhuman would be.
I mean, do we have like, okay, well, yeah, why don't you tell me what
Well,
what
we're
we've done?
talking about the merging of man or God's creation, right, with machine and man-made technology. So,
Sure. As long as, for a Catholic, as long as the principle of totality is respected, things like a bionic arm, bionic leg, those kinds of things, that's all good.
but would you say that transhumanism would be in conflict with the Catholic theology?
If anything that would violate human nature, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we don't have enough time here to keep discussing.
Good questions, though. Excellent
Excellent
question.
question. The good news is that we do have a little bit more time with cheese in the background. Okay, once we eat a little bit, we'll figure out how to.
Yeah, there we go. Right.